So we're back to part 2 tonight. It was lovely, a lovely sharing with you last week, and I've had so many amazing responses coming out, emails and messages, lots of people trying to connect with other people, and that was why I asked Rabbi Raven if maybe we could have a Facebook page where people could connect somehow. Don't worry about messaging. Don't worry about messaging now to Rabbi Raven. We can do that all at the end. And we're just going to get straight on into the talk. So I left you all last night with my great-grandfather about to leave Lithuania. We left it at the end in 1910, beginning of the turn of the century. And we discussed all the history up to that point. And I've got tonight so much detail to fit into such a short space of time that I won't be able to backtrack really at all. So if anybody wants to hear information, please listen to the recording from last week because I'm going to get straight into it now. Literally, almost actually every period that I'm going to talk about tonight, we could have an entire 1 hour or 2 hours on that particular topic. So I'm properly swishing everything in and throwing in my grandfather's story into the mix at the same time, so that there's some relevance to it as well. So I left you last week in Lithuania. So my grandfather basically had received orders to join the Russian army. And they refused to renew his passport. He was born in Lithuania, but he was living in Kurland. And Kurland was at the time not part of the Pale of Settlement. So he, at that stage, had to either join the Russian army or leave. And this applied to many of the men in Lithuania, the young men. They got these call-up orders by the time they turned 20, and they made the choice to either join the Russian army or get out of there fast. So he decided that he was going to leave. He had no idea where he was going. So lots of people messaged and they said, how did he get there? He didn't actually know he was going to South Africa. He just knew he was leaving Lithuania and he didn't have a passport. So the usual way to leave Lithuania was to go through with a ticket agency. There were many ticket agencies in the big towns and they were selling tickets on a ship. And you would go to your local port. It was usually in Lithuania. You'd go usually in Latvia. You would go at the time of Chile. Although some people did leave from Klaipeda in Lithuania if they left sort of in the 20s. But otherwise, before then, like when he left, you would have had to leave through Latvia. But he didn't have a passport, so he actually couldn't leave by boat. So he had to actually leave by land. The way that he left was borrowing a passport from a person who lived on the border with Germany. Now, at the time, Russia, which Lithuania was a part of the Russian Empire, bordered onto East Prussia, so bordered onto Germany. Okay, if you look at a map now of Lithuania, it's not going to look at all like that. But at the time, it bordered Germany, and so he went to a little village on the border, and people that were businessmen that lived in that village could cross the border and they had visas to live in Germany. So he borrowed a passport, went with the brother of the person whose passport he had borrowed. I don't know if passports maybe he didn't have photos on in 1910, or perhaps he looked a little bit like the person, maybe a very smudged photograph, I'm not sure. But I went with the brother, crossed the border with this passport, and literally went into Germany. And from this little village in Germany, gave the passport back, and the brother just crossed back over the border. And he took a train for immigrants in Germany. Couldn't afford a regular train, but there was a train that would take you to the port. And he went to the port of Hamburg, and from Hamburg he went on a little boat, like not a ship. There were 13 people on this boat that they crossed the North Sea with. Must be very rough. Actually, it mentions it was very rough. And he went from there to England, and from England, from Southampton, he went to South Africa. It was at the little village in Germany that he made the decision to go to South Africa. The reason was he had 16 pounds and he needed 15 pounds to go to South Africa. So that was a good decision for him. And also he realized that he did actually have some family in Cape Town. And there were some landsmen, there were some people from his village, from Pushalat, that were living in Johannesburg and in the little towns around Johannesburg. So he made the decision at that point to go to South Africa and took the ship there. I'm going to share the screen. Hopefully I can find some pictures. This is who we're talking about, right? This is my great-grandfather, Ben Dat. I don't know if you can see my pointers. I never watch my videos, so I don't know when you can see and what they can't. But this is a wedding picture here of my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother. Down at the bottom next to him is my gran, Sylvia, and more pictures of my great-grandfather. And actually, I went back onto my internet and found an email from a number of years ago where and obviously been looking at this at the time and found this picture from Lithuania, which I didn't have last week, of the entire extended Dat family. He was number 7 in the family, so there were many siblings, and he's on the top left, and this is his family, and that's his wedding in South Africa. So this is what we're talking about. This is a picture here of the Pale of Settlement. I just wanted to show you that Lithuania was in this area called the Pale of Settlement. Lithuania was, at the time that he left, so certainly from the late 1700s, 1795, all the way through the 800s, all the way through the early 1900s until the First World War, this was the Pale of Settlement. It was under the Russian Empire, and Jews really had to live, if they were living in the Russian Empire, they needed to live in the Pale of Settlement. And the economic situation in the Pale of Settlement was terrible. And there were also, these problems where they, possibly they were going to be recruited to the army. And so they decided at that stage that they would have to leave. So Pale of Settlement there. And this is a picture of the ship that my great-grandfather went on. This ship was called, I'm just trying to get this thing on here. Whoopsie, I've got a frozen, I have got a frozen screen. I knew this could happen potentially. Oh dear me, all right. Oh well, yeah, a completely frozen screen. All right, doesn't matter. This over here was called the Grantilly Castle. Grantilly Castle. The interesting thing about the ship was that it actually landed up being the ship that carried Australian soldiers to Gallipoli. So when I was looking for pictures of it, I actually found pictures in the Australian Museum at the War Memorial in Canberra. It became a hospital ship. You can see those crosses on it. It became a hospital ship also to take wounded soldiers back from Gallipoli afterwards. So this was the Grantilly Castle, but actually this was the ship that took him all the way through to South Africa. And he made a comment that it was the most amazing, beautiful ship that he had actually ever seen. It looks pretty good now, and I looked at pictures of it later. It didn't look so good. If you look over here, you'll see that we have a map from 1910. The amazing thing is to try and find a map from 1910. You'll see the world actually looks like quite a different place. So he's coming from Lithuania. I'll sort of point to that on the map. So just about, you see this orange area here, this is Germany. And so Lithuania is like next to it. And above there, by the sea, there would be Latvia. So he's coming from Lithuania, he's going to Hamburg. You can actually see Hamburg on this map. And then gone down there through Southampton and gone all the way down to Cape Town. And so he's landed up in Cape Town, and didn't stay very long in Cape Town. Landed up going up to Johannesburg. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment and just talk to you a little bit. Okay, so some of the reasons that people left before we mentioned, it was economic, also call-ups to the war. There had been a number of pogroms in the Pale of Settlement in the early 1900s. There the Kishinev pogrom, there was the Odessa pogrom, where many Jews were murdered, and Jews around the Palace settlement actually got very nervous. And even though in Lithuania there hadn't been any pogroms, many of the Jews decided to leave because of the danger that being in the Palace settlement and living under Russia was causing. And now Jews didn't only go to South Africa. Of course, South Africans like to think that, but of course they went to America. America was the Golden Medina. That was a very popular place to go. They went to South America as well. There were farms in South America where people had where agriculture was developing, and they were getting Lithuanian Jews to come and work on these farms. And of course, people went to England, and they also went to other parts of Western Europe. Australia and South Africa, and of course people went to Palestine. So there was a big Zionist movement at the time in Lithuania, especially amongst the youth groups, and the youth groups encouraged people to go and settle in Eretz Israel. And so there was actually quite a big swing from Lithuania to move to go and be a pioneer and go and work in the kibbutzim in Israel. So I'll talk a little bit more about South Africa later, but I really want to go, our talk is on Lithuanian Jewry. And so I really want to go back now to tell you what was happening in Lithuania when he left Lithuania. And then we're going to do, what follows and why. So in the early 1900s, when he left Lithuania, the yeshiva movement was still actually going very strong. And remember, he had been at the Slobodka yeshiva. It was, which was a big yeshiva there, but the yeshiva movement was going very strong. At the same time, the Haskalah, which was the Enlightenment movement, was actually really developing as well, was really strong in Lithuania, especially in Vilna. There were, at the time, 86 magazines, 86 periodicals that were written. 20 of them were in Hebrew. That were being published. I mean, that's a lot of newspapers. We've got, like, the Jewish News and one or two other periodicals here. But if you think in Lithuania, there were 86, mostly coming out of Vilna. Some of them were religious, some of them were Haskalah. There were, just in the Kovna district alone, there were 1,100 private cheders. There were 64 Talmud Torah schools, 52 schools teaching to a state-approved curriculum, and 2,280 Jewish students in public schools. So, Jewish life was really very vibrant at this time. So even though lots of people were leaving and immigrating and people were quite poor, and it was dangerous, there was still an extremely vibrant life in Lithuania. In the 1897 census, there were 757,000 Jews and 757,038 Jews living in Greater Lithuania, because that was also Belarus, that was also northern Ukraine. So in Greater Lithuania, 757,038. 12 communities had more than 20,000 Jews. So now we get to the eve of World War I. My grandfather at that stage already in South Africa. World War I was a very interesting time in Lithuania, not necessarily good. Remember, Lithuania was part of the Russian Empire, okay? And the Russian Empire was having some problems in World War I because they were about to have the communist revolution. So Lithuania is there, the Jews were having a difficult time under the Russians in the Palace settlement. The Lithuanians were not happy that they were under Russian rule. And so they were kind of hoping, and I think everyone was sort of hoping, that the Germans would actually come into Lithuania. So this is World War I, not World War II. We're hoping that they would come into Lithuania and actually take over Lithuania. But the Jews were not helping the Germans in any way, not at all. But somehow rumors, as they always do, got around that the Jews were actually giving secrets away to the Germans. It wasn't true. And so the Russians actually deported about 100,000 Jews, that's a lot of Jews, into the center of Russia. So, or more eastward, out of Lithuania and into proper Russia during this time, because they were concerned that they were giving secrets away to the Germans. They were Jews from the Kovna area, so it's the western part of Lithuania, the part that's quite close to Germany. So, of course, the Germans did actually enter Lithuania in 1916 to 1917, and straight away, actually, things got much better for Jews. There were many Jewish commanders in the army in the First World War, and what the Germans started to do straight away was they looked at this whole Pale of Settlement thing, and they allowed the creation of new Jewish schools, and more Jewish culture was allowed, and there were newspapers and there were house schools, and they instituted Slobodka again. Slobodka had been closed for a little while. So it actually initially was actually very good for the Jews when the Germans came in World War I. And then actually the Germans started talking about incorporating Lithuania into their greater German state. And the Jews were not unhappy with this at all. And actually, I don't think the Lithuanians were too unhappy about it either. Because they had always identified with Germany a little bit. And so they were, just going to be part of a new German state that was called Ober-Est. So the east, over the east, or Ober-Ost. I'm not pronouncing German very well, Ober-Ost. So, so things were not bad. But then the Russian Revolution happened, and this sort of changed everything, because we're going to have a look at the map now. I'm going to share the screen. Okay, share. Okay, this is World War I. You can see that Germany is right next door to Poland. So the map looks quite different in 1914 to how it looks now. We can actually see these little white lines here. These are the borders of the countries now, or certainly after 1918. These are the borders of the countries. But you can see in the First World War, you've got Russia, of which Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia is all part of the Russian Empire. And then you've got Germany right next door. And then you've got that Austro-Hungarian Empire down there. And you can see that the countries that are colored in yellow are allied. Okay, so that was part of that like triple entente. Russia looks like it's in green because it's bowed out of the triple entente at some stage. So we've got Great Britain, France, Italy, and of course it was Russia as well. But so Germany comes into Lithuania, which is part of Russia, and then this Russian Revolution happens in 1917 and 1918. And what happens is Germany is now nervous, because if you make your state right next to Russia, and Russia is now becoming a communist state, and they were very nervous of communism in Germany, they became worried that there was like now no buffer to help them, or to protect them from this big Russian empire that was sitting now right next to them. So what they decided to do was to rather make Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, if they won the war, they were going to make them these little independent states. And that was going to be like their buffer. So Lithuania was one state that went like, wow, this is great. We're quite happy to be our own state. We would actually like the Germans to defeat the Russians here. And then we're going to get our own state. But it was going to be like this like quasi-German puppet state, really. And so like all those initial privileges that the Jews got started to get taken away as the Germans started to lose the war, or things got a little bit more tricky in the war. And actually for Jews and Lithuanians living in First World War Lithuania, life was actually very, very, very difficult. They were starving. There was a real shortage of food, a real shortage of just about anything. There was nothing really crossing the borders. They were hungry, and they were working very hard. Germans were sort of using them a little bit like slave labor. It certainly wasn't concentration camps or anything like that, but it was not an easy life. And actually a lot of people were displaced during the fighting of the First World War. This was the Eastern Front, and so there was a lot of displacement. So people had lost their homes, they'd lost their farms, and things were tough. They were not easy. But then after actually in the beginning of 1918, it was, whoopsies, wrong math. In the beginning of 1918, what actually happened was Lithuania declared itself on the 16th of February. Lithuania declared itself an independent state. The war hadn't actually finished yet. No one knew who was going to win the war in the beginning of 1918. It was still this stalemate. Lithuania took advantage of Russia's bowing out of the war and declared a state. Russia wasn't very happy with this. And there was the Paris Peace Treaty, which said actually, yes, you can have the states Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia. And there were actually a number of states that came out after the First World War with the Treaty of Versailles and with the League of Nations afterwards ratifying all these treaties. So we can see after First World War, we've actually got a number of countries, new countries forming. They're all on the left here: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. Poland was not a country, it was part of a mixture. You can see at the bottom there, it's a mixture of the Russian Empire and also the Austrian, Hungarian Empire, and also the German Empire. So you can see Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Turkey. These are all new countries because all the empires had fallen apart and they were being broken up with the Treaty of Versailles. And Lithuania benefited by becoming its own country, but whoopsies. I'm going to stop sharing for a second so I can talk to you. So basically what then happens is now we've got this new Lithuanian state, and the Jews and the Lithuanians are getting along quite well. The Lithuanians actually needed the Jews because the Jews formed quite a large majority of the minority population. They were the biggest minority in the country. The Jews and the Lithuanians had the same aim there. They wanted an independent state. And actually in the first elections, it was democratic. The first elections, there was actually a Jewish minister of, or a deputy Jewish minister of finance. There was a minister of Jewish affairs. There was also I think there was a deputy foreign minister actually was also Jewish. So incredible that there were Jews actually in parliament. And initially Jews were given lots and lots of rights, and it was great times. So this is 1918. But by 1924, things were already starting to go wrong in this republic, in this sort of independent state. I should also mention initially that as soon as Lithuania became independent, Russia was no longer happy with this and re-invaded them. And actually, luckily, the communist war revolution wasn't going so well, so they actually retracted and went back. So that was the end of the Russian invasion. But then Poland took advantage and came in and took Vilna. And Vilna was the jewel of Lithuania. Even for Jews, Vilna was, Yerushalayim of Lithuania, was Jerusalem of Lithuania. Vilna was the heart of Lithuania, and now Vilna was taken over by Russians. Was taken over by the Poles in the Polish War. They won Vilna. So now the Jewish population, they have now lost a significant amount of people. This new state actually only had 155,000 Jews because they had lost 100 Jews from the Vilna area, the Vilna state, and they had also lost a whole lot of Jews that had been deported into the Russian interior during the First World War. And so we landed with this independent state that is really, the Treaty of Versailles really was a treaty that took away Germany's chance to redevelop. It messed up pretty much the whole of Europe by creating little individual states based on ethnicity. And when you've got states that are based on ethnicity, ultimately nationalism is going to develop, because those ethnic states try and make sure that they're the complete majority in the state and try and slowly get rid of the minorities in those states. And that is really what happened after the Treaty of Versailles came along in all the Baltic states, in Poland as well, in the other states that had been created, and certainly in Lithuania as well. And so once you've got extra nationalism, it becomes things like Lithuania for Lithuanians. And gradually an ultra-nationalist government comes in and the Jews lose their rights. And with all this nationalism comes anti-Semitism. And right throughout the 20s and the 30s in Europe, you've got this incredible buildup of anti-Semitism right throughout Europe. Right throughout Europe happening. And Lithuania is absolutely no exception to the rule. The rights of Jews slowly go. There's also not only nationalism building up, but there's economic competition that begins to happen because Lithuania starts to become more urbanized, and as it does, more Lithuanians move out of farms and they move into the cities. And as soon as they move into the cities, now suddenly economically they're in competition with the Jews. And so the Jews start to do progressively worse and the Lithuanians do better. And as Jews are not needed in society, it becomes very dangerous for Jews. We always have to be very needed. If we're not needed, things become unsafe. And so anti-Semitism increases. There's also huge anti-Semitism now developing in Germany in the late 20s, early 30s, with the rise of Nazism next door in Germany. And that sort of reflects over into Lithuania, which has always been quite closely affiliated with Germany anyway. And so the media begins to become extremely anti-Semitic, and there's a lot of propaganda. So before the war, before all the atrocities that happened in the Second World War, there is already this buildup of anti-Semitism that's happening. Something is going to explode. And whilst Lithuania never really sees the pogroms that Poland sees and Romania sees before the war, anti-Semitism is like this pent-up anger that is there sitting, waiting to burst. And I'm going to try and do this again because I think my computer keeps on freezing. It has totally frozen. Okay. All right. So we're going to move on now to the Second World War and see what happens. I'm going to share the screen just for a second. That's the end of World War I and the interwar period. So World War II comes along in 1939. Hitler has risen to power in 1933. We've got this, sort of building up of anti-Semitism around Europe, plus all around Europe, plus nationalism developing, and Germany having ideas of taking over the world. So of course they're going to look at their neighbors. What the rest of the world didn't know was that there was the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that was between Russia and between Germany. And so the world sort of was watching Germany, but had no idea that Russia was then going to hop along with Germany, and they were going to go and invade Poland straight away and split it up. So in the beginning of 1939, 1st of September, the Nazis invaded Poland. And remember, Vilna is part of Poland. So, but it's not taken over by the Nazis. Vilna becomes part that's taken over by the Russians. And once the Russians come into Poland, to the eastern part of Poland, Lithuania is sitting there thinking, okay, now like what exactly is going to happen? Because Lithuania probably had closer ties to Germany than they actually did to Russia. But when Germany had actually asked them before the war to ally with them, they weren't interested because I think they were an independent state and they actually didn't, like, they just didn't want to fight or have to fight another war or be too closely allied with Germany. So once Russia invades, they basically said to Lithuania, look, I'm going to stop sharing for a second. Yeah, we'll give you a carrot. You know Vilna, you want Vilna very much. You can have Vilna if you allow us to annex Lithuania. So we won't invade Lithuania. We won't damage Lithuania. We'll leave Lithuania as is, but you let us use all your resources and all your facilities. We'll just annex it. We'll make it part of Russia. We'll use everything that you have. Give us free reign there. And if you want, we'll give you Vilna back. So Lithuania sort of says, okay, well, we'll have Vilna back. So once Lithuania's got Vilna back, suddenly there's like now a lot of Jews living back in Lithuania. So it's really, by the end of 1939, beginning of 1940, there's 250,000 Jews that are now living in Lithuania. We sort of got an extra 100,000. And that is because of the flood of Jews that had come into Vilna. Once Poland was invaded, the Jews actually chose Vilna because it was owned by, at the time, it was taken over by the Russians. And so you're going to pick the lesser of the two evils. So Jews streaming into Vilna, and now Vilna is part of Lithuania, and everything's actually sort of okay under the Soviet Union. So of course it affected the Jews quite a bit in the beginning, because the Jews mostly owned businesses, and unfortunately Russia nationalized, the Soviets nationalized all the businesses. So the Jews lost their businesses and they lost their income, but then they also were able now suddenly to be part of the society more. They were allowed to be in government, or they were allowed to, they were employed by the state, whereas things had become so anti-Semitic before the war had broken up that Jews actually were not allowed to be employed by the state. Jews had problems in the university as well. Like from 1938 in the university in Kaunas, Jews were already sitting at their own benches, and admissions to university had really trickled down to a bare minimum. So now that Russia was in there, it was actually a little bit easier for the Jews, even though they lost their businesses. They did have an income because they were employed by the state. And this was definitely the less of the two evils, and the Jews were not terribly miserable that Russia had come in. But very unfortunately, what then happens is Germany breaks this Ribbentrop-Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and Germany decides to invade. And once they do invade, things really start to go very, very bad, very, very quickly for Jews. Okay, so they come in basically on the 22nd of June. I'm going to share the screen now. 22nd of June, 1941. So Russia really only had it for a year, properly. And this is over here. This is a very famous picture. I don't know if you can see this picture of this lady crying. This is a picture of deportations from Kotna ghetto. So what happens is the Lithuanian nationalists have been waiting very carefully for the Germans to come in, because they are secretly allied with the Germans. Once the Germans come in, very quickly, the Lithuanian collaborators are joined to certain units of the Nazi Anzac group, and I'm going to explain all about these Anzac group in a moment. And they start to kill pretty much straight away. So they come in on the 22nd of June. By the 28th of June, there's already 5,000 Jews that have been murdered. So it happens super quickly, unfortunately, in Lithuania, whereas in Poland, there was ghettoization first, and then for a while, and then after then it was moving from the ghettos to extermination camps, or to other concentration camps. But in Lithuania, unfortunately, whilst there were a few ghettos, there were really 4 big ghettos, and lots of little sort of tiny little collection ghetto points that were sometimes only there for 2 or 3 days. The shooting squads start pretty much immediately in Lithuania, and the Lithuanian collaborators this is not all Lithuanian people, of course, but the Lithuanian collaborators, people who were certainly pro-Germany, came along and were recruited by the Nazi Anzac group and to help them round up Jews and to shoot them. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of explanation on Anzac group. So there were many Anzac group. There were really like 6 big ones, and there was 18, I think, all in all. So these were the shooting squads of Nazis that followed directly behind the Wehrmacht. So the Wehrmacht would come in, they would invade. That's the army, the German army, and just behind them were these units called Einsatzgruppe. And they were often just, ordinary men that had been recruited to, instead of fight in the war, to rather come and round up Jews and shoot them. And actually, no one was ever forced to shoot Jews in the Einsatzgruppe. They actually voluntarily participated. There's many stories and many theories about why ordinary men would have gone and participated in these absolutely awful atrocities. People like Christopher Browning has written amazing books on this, one called actually Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning, where he looks at how ordinary people become these killers straight away. But Lithuanian collaborators are also rounded up really quickly and helped to participate in the Lithuanian massacres. And that just means that people are going to be rounded up much quicker, and they're going to be killed much quicker than they were in other places where people from the population didn't also collaborate. The main Anzac group that went to Lithuania was actually Anzac Group A. It was headed by a man called Franz Walter Stahlecker. He was head of Anzac Group A, and within Anzac Group A there was like Anzac Commander, 2, Anzac Commander 3, and Anzac Commander 3 was run by a colonel by the name of Karl Jaeger. Now, the unbelievable thing with Karl Jaeger is we have a collection of reports that he wrote. He was head of Anzac Group 3, Anzac Commander 3, which was under Anzac Group A. He wrote out pedantically every single day how many Jews had been massacred, had been shot into these pits. Often they had to go into the forest, they had to build the pit themselves sometimes, and they were shot into these pits. Other times they would, the pits were already there, or the pits were already quite big, and Jews would be shot into them. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of people in a very, very, very short space of time. So they invaded in June, in June 1941, and by December 1941, 180,000 Jews in Lithuania have already been murdered. Remember, there were 220,000 Jews, but from June till November, or June to December, 180,000 have already been killed. So the killing operation was very structured, and it was by shooting. They were not killed by going to gas chambers in Lithuania. Only much later, if they'd remained in the ghetto, when they moved on to the Polish death camps. But in general, in Lithuania, the majority of Jews were killed by these Einsatzgruppe, these German soldiers, together with Lithuanian collaborators. And that we are very lucky in the Melbourne Holocaust Museum to have a copy of this Jaeger report. A museum, I work at the museum as a volunteer guide. Our museum is currently down at the moment because we're building a beautiful museum. But when you do have time in the future to come and visit the museum, please do go and look right through that Jaeger report. You can see every village where Anzac Commander 3 went. You can see how many women were killed, how many children were killed, how many men were killed, how many communists were killed, how many traitors were killed on the day, but it's obviously majority Jews, where they completely wiped out villages. So where villages were 90% Jewish, there was there was almost no one left in these villages afterwards. And it's pedantically written out. It's quite scary when you actually have a look through it. I've just got one page here, but there's page after page after page after page. And at the end of this incredibly detailed report, Karl Jaeger himself writes a whole long story about how he has made Lithuania Jew-free, how he has done his duty, a really good duty, he's done it extremely well, and how the Lithuanians will be so happy that he has cleansed their country of Jews. I'll just show you just a few of these pictures. The one picture here, I mean, if you look on the internet, the pictures of the Einsatzgruppe are so bad, you actually will have completely sleepless nights. So I tried very carefully what to select. So the picture over here is actually a Kovna action. It's a roundup in Kovna. And we have a number of men literally standing in queues just waiting to be shot. And that happened at the 9th Fort in Kovna. We've got a picture here at the bottom here. This is actually from a massacre that happened in Kovna as well. This was Anzac Group 3, but actually this massacre happened before was actually just before and as the Anzac came in there. So on the 23rd of June, the Anzac had come in, or Germany had invaded on the 22nd of June. On the 23rd of June, this, or 25th of June, I think, well, actually 25th of June, to be accurate. This happened outside a garage in Kovna, where a man called the death dealer of Kovna just literally went and brutally killed people. This was not even shootings, this was bludgeoning, literally. And you've got groups of Lithuanian collaborators here literally killing people in the streets. And these are onlookers. They wouldn't necessarily have been at all happy to see what they were seeing, but they were still watching nevertheless. So really, really horrific. And this middle picture here is actually not from Lithuania. I just put the picture in because it really shows, it's a very, very famous picture. It's actually from the Ukraine. But this picture here shows a man being shot into. It's kind of interesting because they would never usually be that close up there. We're usually further back, and it was usually a whole bunch of people standing at the pits being shot into the pits. But this is a particularly famous picture. But just in case someone says to me that's not from Lithuania, it isn't. That picture is not from Lithuania. But if you want to see pictures, there's thousands of them on the internet. Was there resistance? Yes, there was resistance in the ghetto. So there were, remember I said that there were like 4 main ghettos. Vilna was one, Kovna was one, Shagi was one. And the other ghettos had just literally been collection points in villages that maybe, as I said before, lasted 2 or 3 days, where people would be sort of starved, really bad atrocities were perpetrated on these people, and then they would be taken to pits and killed. But the main ghettos were still in existence until 1943. I think the last one standing was beginning of 1944. And there was resistance. People like Abba Kovna in the Vilna ghetto, he said, like, we won't be led like sheep to the slaughter. We are going to stand up. And they started to make contact with people on the partisans on the border with Belarus and Lithuania, and started to have some connections with these partisans. And they did actually manage to smuggle in some arms, and they did manage to smuggle people out of the ghettos into the forests. This did definitely happen, but it was on a very small scale compared to the amount of people that had been completely murdered. I'm going to just stop sharing for a second, because I probably need to mention that there's tons of sites in Lithuania. If you go and visit Lithuania today, there are tons of forests in Lithuania. It is absolutely full of forests, and there are tons of killing sites at these forests, in Lithuania. The main ones, of course, we've got the 9th Fort in Kovna and the 7th Fort, but there's also Ponari near Vilna. And in Ponari, about 70,000 Jews were killed. It's insane to actually imagine that this could have happened, and it happened so quickly to the Jews of Lithuania. But this is what happened. So if you wonder how many, 96% of Lithuanian Jews were killed, and from the ones that were, when the ghettos were then liquidated, the majority were then sent to other little ghettos in Latvia and Estonia. Others were sent to the death camps in Poland. But of those, I think only 6,000 returned. So that's of the 40,000 that were interned in ghettos, 6,000 returned. Actually, Russia, just before Germany invaded, Russia took about 15,000 people that they accused of being anti-Soviet, of which, they actually took more, but about 15,000 of them were Jewish. And they took these Jews and other Lithuanians who they thought were anti-Soviet and moved them into the interior in Russia. And fortunately, it saved most of their lives. So out of the 15,000, about half of them actually survived the war, and then some of them came back to Lithuania, and others left to go to America or go to Israel. But they were much safer if they'd been arrested by the Russians and taken into the Russian interior than they were if they'd remained behind in Lithuania. And so now, you know, what do we have now in Lithuania? So if we think of Lithuanian Jews, there are still 3,000 Jews left in Lithuania now. There is a little community in a few of the cities, and they do have cultural programs and Hebrew and Yiddish programs, and there are shuls there, but it's a very, very, very minuscule, small community compared to, you know, what was the Litvak Jewish community. So thank goodness people did manage to leave. But when we think of that Litvak community, we really, you know, we think now of the war and we think of the destruction, but we do need to go back and think of what it was like for people living in there, and you know, or living there before all these atrocities happened, the vibrancy of the life there. And I actually, over the past week, I mentioned earlier, I have had a lot of people sending me information, but I have to mention that I had incredible information sent to me by somebody regarding Pushalat, which is the village that my great-grandfather's from, and I really so appreciate getting all this information. And there's a man by the name of Howard Margle. He's the late Howard Margle, who was actually the head of Jewish genealogy, head of Jewish Gen, the genealogical site. And his family was from Pushalat, and so he spent his life looking into the stories around Pushalat and trying to find out more and more and more information. And he really was sort of an ambassador for Litvak Jews from Pushalat. And one of his relatives has sent me his information, and there's an incredible piece that's written about the life and death of a shtetl, and it's about Pushalat. It's about my great-grandfather's village, his shtetl. So try and read that. You can actually find it. On Jewish Gen. It's called Life and Death of a Shtetl, but it really explains the vibrancy of life before the war. Like, you really get to see what it was like the food that they ate, like all the potatoes and the cucumbers. Well, no wonder we have pickles and kugel. But and the bar mitzvahs where they didn't give presents, it was there, and they didn't actually learn for their bar mitzvah parsha because, of course, they knew it all very well before. It was really incredible. So try, I try when I think of Lithuanian Jewry, I try not to think of all the distraction. I try and think what was there before. And this really, so Life and Death of a Shtetl by Howard Margle really gives you a very good idea of what it was like living there. So I just show you what Pushalat looks like today. I'm going to share the screen. If I can find it. Here it was. Okay, there we go. Let's Pushalat today. Whoops, I'm going to try and mute myself. There, this is the shul over here, and we have there's a little plaque that's been put up in memory of the Jews of Pushalat, and there is still like a little cottage over here that's standing, a wooden cottage that's apparently going to become a museum. And the late Howard Margle did used to go to Pushalat, and apparently he was very welcomed there by the villagers who live there now. Just to let you know, there are no more Jews in Pushalat. All the Jews were murdered, and they were murdered in the forests around Ponovich. So just to stop sharing for a second, I just want to go back to my great-grandfather's story, because you might want to know what happened to my great-grandfather. So he arrived in South Africa. He was 19 when he arrived in South Africa. I didn't actually tell you before, but he had gone to an eye specialist to try, and I'm an optometrist, by the way, so this is for me like a particularly interesting story. He was very short-sighted, and he tried to get out of the army by saying that he was too short-sighted to be in the Russian army, and he went to go and see an eye specialist in Latvia to try and get this exemption, and he didn't get the exemption. So I'm very, 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 very grateful to this eye specialist in Lithuania for not giving him the exemption, because if he had the exemption, he would have potentially stayed in Latvia, where he was quite happy, and not had to move over to South Africa. So anyway, he eventually does move to South Africa. It doesn't stay in Cape Town for very long, and makes his way up to Johannesburg. Now, Johannesburg was already quite a vibrant place by the time he arrived there. There had been Jews living in South Africa, all the way from the 1600s, mid-1600s, when Jan van Riebeeck had arrived there. But really, Jews started coming to South Africa en masse in the 1820s, all the way through to the 1880s, and then really the amounts increased from the 1880s to 1914. So about 4,000 Jews in 1880 and 40,000 Jews by 1914. That's a huge amount. And of course, the Lithuanian Jews had heard about Samuel Marks, who had gone there from a tiny little village in Lithuania and become this huge, big mining magnate and business entrepreneur. And he was sending lots of money back to Lithuania, and so they thought that they were going to make some money there as well. There'd been a gold rush in Johannesburg in 1886, and so lots of Jews made their way up to Johannesburg. My great-grandfather went to Potchefstroom. There was someone from Pushalat that was living there, and then he landed up having a little shop in Johannesburg, which wasn't very successful. He sold ice cream and oranges in a tiny little shop, and he didn't do very well. And then he landed up moving on to a place called Hartbeesfontein, where he worked for another Jewish family. He gives lots of details, but I'm not going to go into these details. And then he lands up buying cattle and having some Afrikaans people look after these cattle for him. And eventually he lands up in a town called Lichtenburg, which was in the Transvaal, is now northwest, I think, northwest. I don't know the new South African provinces, but that is where it is now. And here I left a long time ago. And yeah, so he lands up there and actually starts a shop, gets married, has 6 children, of which my gran was the oldest, 3 boys and 3 girls, and has a number of different business partners, and eventually lands up buying the Fords, or lands up starting the Ford dealership in Lichtenburg, and then the Ford dealership in Mafeking and in Port Elizabeth, and becomes an extremely wealthy man. So by the time I knew my great-grandfather, he was actually an extremely, well, he was old, but he was an extremely successful and wealthy businessman. But just to let you know, in South Africa, why did the immigration from Lithuania stop? So why didn't more Jews leave Lithuania and come to South Africa? And that's interesting, because in 1930, an act was passed in South Africa called the Quota Act. And basically what they said was, look, we've got enough Baltic people here. We don't want any more Eastern Europeans. And so this Quota Act of 1930 stopped Jews from coming into South Africa, specifically Eastern European Jews. But it didn't stop German Jews from coming in. So about 6,000 German Jews, because they were considered westernized, unlike us plebeian Eastern European Jews. So the Western European Jews were considered, you know, they were going to integrate more fully into society than the Eastern European Jews had. And so you've got a number of German Jews, 6,000 Jews arriving in South Africa before 1937. By 1937, there's a new act called the Aliens Act, and that means no Jews whatsoever may enter South Africa. So from 1937, when Jews really did need to come, they could not get into South Africa. It was absolutely prohibited for Jews to come into South Africa. And there were many South Africans that were actually quite sympathetic to the Nazis. There were these grey shirts, there was the Osaba Brandfach, that were very sympathetic and didn't feel that the government should be pro-Britain, that they should rather be pro-Germany. And there was actually a lot of anti-Semitism in South Africa during this time. My grand's brother was actually a pilot for the South African army fighting for Britain. And unfortunately, on takeoff, his plane was sabotaged by one of these right-wing South African groups that was pro-Nazi. They sabotaged his plane, and his plane came down and he was killed in South Africa on takeoff. So true stories of unfortunately, a lot of sympathy towards the Nazis. But basically 90% of South African jury are Litvaks. And it's very interesting because South Africa was so isolated from the world for so long. We didn't really have much integration. Like there weren't too many people coming to South Africa after then. And so Litvaks tended to marry Litvaks. And because it was such a high percentage of people in the country that were of Litvak origin, the traditions, like the original traditions from Lithuania, are still maintained by South African jury. So it's a very homogenous group, and the traditions have really been preserved extremely well from any sort of other intervening cultures. So I have not visited Lithuania myself, but I would love to visit Lithuania, and I really would love to walk in my great-grandfather's footsteps. I want to visit the towns and villages where he's from. And there's so many of them mentioned in the autobiography with so much description that I really do want to go and see that. And I want to go and visit Vilna. I want to go and see where the Vilna Gaon lived. And I want to go and see where the Slobodka Yeshiva was that my great-grandfather studied at. And please God, one day when we've got no coronavirus in this world, we'll be allowed to go and visit some of these countries. But I really, really, really do want to go and visit Lithuania. There's just a message to say 11.3% of Australian Jews are South African born. There you go, 11.3% of South African Jews living in, of Australian Jews are actually of South African origin. Interesting. So all these Litvaks coming to Australia. Okay, so yes, I was saying I would love to go to Lithuania, and I do want to go and see where my great-grandfather lived. And if you've enjoyed this talk and you decide that you want to know a bit more about your own heritage, if you are Litvak or you're interested in Lithuanian Jewish heritage, or you're actually interested in any of your ancestral heritage, there are a number of websites that you can look at. You know, look into it now. Speak to your parents, speak to your grandparents if you can. Try and find that information if you can. You know, the best information that you find is from them directly, but if you can't, there are a number of websites that you actually can look at to find out information. I'm going to share my screen quickly so you can see some of these websites. I'm going to move myself here. Whoops, I'm going to put myself back there. And you can see jewishgen.org. That's full of databases, incredible databases where you can actually have a look at all the information on villages. Names are there. You can find names of your family. You can find where they're born. It's incredible. Look at Jewish Gen. There's Kahila links, which tells you about little villages, about all the shtetls, about towns. Lots and lots and lots of information about different Kahilas, not only in Lithuania. There's the Yivo Encyclopedia, which is, I found a lot of information from there. It's the Eastern European Jewry Encyclopedia. It's all online. There's litvatsig.org, which again, databases of Lithuanian people of Litvak descent. And for South Africans living in Australia, there's a website there. It's Eli Rabinovitz. He is an expert on Litvaks, so you can contact him. And then, of course, the Jewish Holocaust Center, I had to put that in there because I have been a guide there for many years, and there's lots of information in the center, and there's lots of information on their websites as well. So if you go onto the website, you can pretty much, you can find lots and lots of documents that you can find information about, and also testimonies of different survivors. So, oh, I'm going to stop sharing.